Though it bore his name, the shop of Robert Stewart was far more than one man, but rather a diverse community of workers who built the shop's success. Men and women, white and black, free and enslaved.
Welcome to Polk's America. I'm Thomas Samuel. On this episode, we're zooming in on life in the 19th century with the President James K. Polk Home and Museum curator Candice Candeto. She introduced us to Robert Stewart and his furniture shop in Natchez, Mississippi. Candice is a colleague, and I don't think she would mind if I called her a decorative arts nerd. And I mean that in the best way possible. When I look at a table or a chest of drawers, I see a table or a chest of drawers. Candice, now she sees the stories inherent in the object, the laborer, the maker, the owner. And it's these people, normal people, whose stories sometimes tell us more about our history than celebrities, politicians, and war. Here's Candice.
In the first few days of 1853, a cherry bookcase bumped along the road from Natchez, Mississippi, its glass doors rattling towards its destination, John Carmichael Jenkins' plantation home, Elgin. Jenkins was a wealthy horticulturalist and planter with 700 acres of land on the outskirts of town. He had contacted local cabinet maker Robert Stewart about creating a bookcase to match one that he had purchased from Stewart earlier. As Jenkins explained in his diary, the piece was to be designed, quote, to join the old one in the library, the two together extending entirely across the room. So Robert Stewart's shop went to work. The bookcase began as links of cherry and pine, perhaps processed at the local sawmill where Stewart often acquired his lumber. Stewart assigned the bookcase to his journeyman, Fred Hinston Hinch. Working in the shop, Hinch was surrounded by dozens of other journeymen, apprentices, and laborers, all in a flurry of activity, with sawdust and the smell of varnish in the air, the noise of dozens of voices and active tools filling the space. The journeyman completed work on the case in about 9 days, and he received $18 from Stewart for his labor. Stewart's men then loaded the bookcase onto a wagon that Jenkins had sent into town. An enslaved man named Dick was entrusted with the bookcase installation, as he often was in Stewart's shop. Approaching the grand house with its double gallery, Dick arrived at Elgin and set up the bookcase in the library next to the earlier one. Working by the fires glowing beneath Elgin's marble mantles, Dick absorbed the most up-to-date furnishing choices of wealthy customers like Jenkins. Perhaps he shared what he saw with Robert Stewart upon his return to town. So I tell this story largely because I can, and by that I mean that it is exceptionally rare to be able to so thoroughly trace one piece of furniture from its creation to its installation in the home. This story of the Jenkins bookcase illuminates the operation of the Stewart shop as a group of craftspeople and laborers with varied but very interconnected roles.
Candice told us that Robert Stewart is perhaps the best documented artisan of the antebellum South. During his 50-year career in Natchez, he kept meticulous ledgers, cash books, and plantation diaries. These volumes, in addition to a growing number of surviving furniture pieces, create an intricate picture of life in the Gulf South during Polk's America.
Robert Stewart's early life remains largely a mystery. We know that he was born in Chester County, Pennsylvania in 1795, and that he likely learned cabinet making from a relative. That was pretty typical for that time period. As a young man, Robert set out with his brothers Miller and George for the Southwest, presumably sharing some of the aspirations of the thousands of other Americans who embarked on that same journey in the years following the Louisiana Purchase. The Natchez that Robert Stewart found upon his arrival, which was likely around 1816, was a town on the rise. When you think of the Western South in this period, perhaps you imagine an agricultural area or a rough frontier sort of space. But Natchez is and was unique, and this is really important to remember when we consider Stewart's shop and the customers that it served. By the time that Stewart arrived in town in 1816, Natchez actually had many of the cornerstones of a modern American city, with government buildings like a city hall and a jail, houses of worship, and a growing population of over 2,000 people. A series of streets had been laid out in a neat rectangular grid, which was fashioned after Philadelphia's. And before Stewart arrived, Natchez was already supporting a growing woodworking industry. There were 6 carpenters, 5 cabinet makers, and 1 chair maker who were all working in Natchez by 1812, before Stewart got there.
Robert Stewart started his career in Natchez when he and an early partner took over the successful shop of a deceased cabinet maker. Candice mentioned this shop had 8 cabinet makers' benches and a variety of pattern books and fine tools used to create everything from wooden screws to fine furniture. Stewart's first partnership was short-lived, but it demonstrated that he was working in a town with an established furniture industry and market, a fact that made it possible for him to strike out on his own.
In the early years of his career, Robert Stewart acted as a generalist rather than a specialist, seemingly taking any job that his tools and knowledge of wood would enable him to complete. And this was really typical of cabinet making in this time period, so he made a wide range of products beyond just furniture, or of course coffins, and this included things like clothespins. He made a 10-pin set, which is, for bowling, a yardstick. He actually even made an artificial leg at one point, which is kind of fascinating. The shop made at least 133 cribs and cradles between the years of 1834 and 1856. They were usually cherry, and they were usually pretty simple in form, judging by the price and by the quantity produced. It's less ornamented, and it's more utilitarian pieces like this that typically do not survive, but they were nevertheless a really integral part of the material life of early Natchez, and they were really critical to Stewart's business and its success.
Robert Stewart sustained his business as a generalist, but his shop was capable of creating furniture on par with the pieces imported from the bigger cities back east. While completing her graduate research, Candice Candeto traveled to Natchez to study objects from the Stewart shop. While there, she met a woman named Betty Stewart, a widow of a direct descendant of Robert Stewart. Betty had in her possession a chest of drawers with a very special detail.
So you've got this stylish mahogany veneered column bureau, and it has this rare signature in black paint. It says R&M Stewart, Natchez. So the M here refers to Miller, which is Robert Stewart's brother. The two brothers first became business partners when Miller helped run Robert's shop in right around 1819, while Robert was stricken with yellow fever. Robert's illness lasted for 4 months, but the business partnership lasted until Miller's death in 1831. The pair opened a furniture manufactory up the river in Cincinnati, which Miller superintended, where they made a wide range of pieces that were then imported back down to Natchez. So the ornate detail of the carving of this chest of drawers and the exceptionally neat dovetails, they're, of the quality that you would see in a major manufacturing center. They testify to this really high quality of craftsmanship and to the high level of style that's being produced specifically for the Western and Southern markets during this time period. And this is something that's often been overlooked by decorative art scholarship. I think you see that in Middle Tennessee right here as well. There was a great deal of wealth in this area too during this time period, as there was in Natchez. And now tragically, we don't have much surviving to tell us what specific furnishings were in the Polk home during this time period. But by looking at similar sites and some of the places that we know that the Polks were visiting, we can assume that they had access to things like this too.
This podcast is produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. Our site is unique among historic homes, as it is not furnished as it existed in 1816 when it was constructed. Instead, the Polk Home collection consists of important pieces from the lives of the 11th President and First Lady, spanning the entirety of James Polk's political career and Sarah Polk's widowhood. Sadly, not much remains from James's time living in Columbia, so Candice and our staff must rely on useful comparisons like other wealthy families and objects like Betty Stewart's chest of drawers to better understand James Polk's life in Columbia, Tennessee in the early 1800s.
But most of the surviving furniture of Robert Stewart is later than this chest, and it dates to maybe the 10 or 15 years before the Civil War. And that's partly because by 1850, Natchez's wealth was really at a peak. There were these enormous jaw-dropping homes appearing on the landscape, built by a class of men who made their fortunes in cotton and sugar. John T. McMurrin was one such member of this privileged class. A group of surviving furniture at McMurrin's grand home, Melrose, provides an interesting case study for the ways that the ultra-wealthy looked to Stewart's shop for creating their domestic statements of wealth and power, and also where they looked elsewhere to do so. Stewart sold these 2 walnut wardrobes to McMurrin in 1852. They were likely made locally in Natchez, as Stewart's journeymen were actively making walnut wardrobes right in this price range around the time of this purchase. The survival of the 2 wardrobes at Melrose documents the fine details and craftsmanship that came out of the Stewart shop to furnish Natchez homes in this period, and the extent to which even ultra-wealthy planters were at times satisfied with Mississippi-made furniture, even when they had access to height-of-fashion imports. So these are people who can very easily acquire goods from Philadelphia, from New York, from Baltimore, and in fact, they're even spending time personally, large chunks of time in the summer in those cities. So the assumption was often that these men weren't buying locally made things, they were doing their shopping elsewhere. But in fact, the Stewart shop demonstrates to us that not only was Natchez fully capable of producing grand furniture like these wardrobes, but planters like McMurrin, who had resources to shop elsewhere, were even able to purchase and willing to purchase from people in their own community. Massive custom-fit pieces that would have been cumbersome to ship provided opportunity for local makers like Stewart. For 10 weeks in 1848, Stewart's journeyman, a man named Harper Hamerton, worked on these stunning bookcases for McMurrin's library at Melrose. Robert Stewart paid him $109 for his labor, but the exact nature of Hamerton's relationship with Stewart remains unknown. Do the bookcases represent the skill of an exceptional journeyman, or the careful management, teaching, and even the hand of Robert Stewart as the master cabinet maker? Regardless of the balance between these 2 men, the bookcases certainly speak to what Stewart's shop was capable of creating for its wealthiest clients, who called on local cabinet makers to fill the gaps where Philadelphia or New York furniture could not meet customer needs.
As a historian and curator, Candice Candeto wants us to look closely at the decorative arts and recognize the stories intrinsic to each piece. However, Candice cautions us to be careful of bias. It is important in history to consider the story of what is lost, not just what is tangible.
So, surviving furniture, it's a remarkable way for us to understand Robert Stewart's business. But just like written documentary sources, it does come with biases. The furniture that remains in Natchez today represents some of the finest pieces produced by the Stewart shop, and perhaps some of the finest furniture produced in antebellum Mississippi. These are incredibly important survivals because they demonstrate a really high quality of local production. And that's important because local production in Mississippi has really been overlooked. But this can also be a misleading representation of the tasks and the products that actually kept Stewart in business for 50 years. Stewart and his journeymen produced grand cabinet pieces and tables, but they also produced modest benches and stands, and provided undertaking and furniture repair services. And it was the combination of all of these that made the business successful and allowed Stewart to reach a wide range of customers in Natchez.
To provide a clearer picture of the shop of Robert Stewart, Candice turned to documentation of the day-to-day operations left behind in the prolific cabinet maker's detailed ledgers.
The extensive documentation of Robert Stewart's business also provides a unique opportunity to understand the many diverse contributors to the labor of a 19th century cabinet-making shop, and especially one in the antebellum South. Dozens of almost entirely anonymous journeymen were primarily responsible for furniture production in the shop of Robert Stewart by about 1840. Robert Stewart's accounts list them by their full name or sometimes just their surname, and when they do have a full name, it's often really badly misspelled, and a lot of German and Irish names were anglicized, so that makes it really hard to identify who these men were at times. He was often paying them with a combination of boarding, tools, materials, and cash. And Stewart kept careful records of when each journeyman commenced work for the shop, and what work exactly they produced. The journeymen were paid either by the piece or by the hour. For efficiency, they were sometimes assigned to produce one specific form in bulk. So for instance, a dozen bedsteads, 8 end tables, or 4 sideboards at a time. They sometimes were employing some of the same theories of workflow that were taking place in much larger operations. For instance, an artisan would exclusively produce just one single simple furniture element for the course of their employment with that shop. This method obviously maximizes time and the use of space and tools, but other times journeymen devoted weeks or even months to just a single large project, and sometimes they worked away from the shop and on site at the customer's home. Stewart's journeymen varied in their abilities, but even the more skilled artisans were still assigned the most basic of the shop's products at times. A journeyman named J.A. Kirk, he was paid $55 one time for making just 2 mahogany presses. So these really expensive, beautiful, big pieces of furniture. But he also helped make coffins, and though a journeyman called London spent most of his time in the Stewart shop just making pretty much the most basic thing you can make, which is a brick mold. On one occasion, he also made 4 pretty nice sideboards. So you've got this range here. White women also contributed to the shop of Robert Stewart as well. You find the names of white women like Mrs. Roberts, Mrs. Weaver, Mrs. Sylvester, all throughout the Stewart ledgers. And these were women who he hired to make ticking for beds. Ticking, of course, is the textile covering that helps keep all of the stuffing contents of a mattress inside. These women allowed Stewart to maximize his profit by not having to pay to import that ticking from somewhere else.
Paid men and women were essential to Stewart's operation, creating brick molds to bookcases. If you remember, the bouncing bookcase from the story at the beginning of this episode was produced by a journeyman named Hinch. But that bookcase was delivered and installed by an enslaved man named Dick, a reminder of the exploitation of labor at the hands of Stewart and others in the antebellum South.
Robert Stewart's remarkably well-documented life and business shed light on the operations of cabinet making in the 19th century, and they remind us to consider the many hands and the dark reality of slavery that made these beautiful pieces possible, both from a broad social and economic perspective and in exposing the contributions of enslaved labor in furniture production. According to the 1850 slave schedule, Robert Stewart enslaved 17 people in Natchez in 1850, 3 boys, 5 men, 3 girls, and 6 women. Some of these would have worked as domestic servants in Stewart's large household, which was managed by his wife Susanna. Some of these, though, worked primarily in the furniture and undertaking business. By 1850, enslaved people made up the majority of the population of Adams County, Mississippi, where Natchez is located. Though most of these people did labor in agricultural settings on plantations, many worked for artisans in skilled and unskilled positions, an important reminder of the breadth of the enslaved experience in early America. Enslaved people in the Stewart shop built coffins, transferred materials, and completed pieces from the river to the shop to the customer. They also picked hair, which is a description to describe the collecting of Spanish moss, which was then used for stuffing upholstery, things like mattresses and stuffed chairs. Much of Stewart's role in his furniture shop revolved around these wide networks of labor management designed to make him the most money possible. But Stewart also took on another role, one that he and President James K. Polk once again shared, and that is the role of absentee plantation holder. Even the Pennsylvania-born Robert Stewart could not resist the unique opportunity offered by the South, the chance to reign over a piece of the Cotton Kingdom. So on the eve of the Civil War, at around 62 years of age, Robert Stewart made a career change. Though he had identified himself as a cabinet maker for the 1850 census and in advertisements for the previous 3 decades, the cabinet maker called himself a farmer for the 1860 census. Stewart's decision to diversify his income with cotton meant that he had more capital to invest in growing the furniture business. and specifically in purchasing imported furniture for his customers. It also has important implications for how we understand the social role of the cabinet maker in the 19th century Gulf South. This shows us that the division between the artisan middle class and the planter elites then is not so concrete, because Stewart here was at once artisan, merchant, and planter. When Stewart was doing business with a planter like McMurrin at Melrose, the customer and the cabinet maker actually had more in common than initially meets the eye. Though McMurrin's acreage and number of slaves was vastly higher than Stewart's, both could call themselves masters of the Louisiana plantation. Both would have shared anxieties, like threats to their crops, for instance. And when Stewart unboxed, sold, or made furniture for McMurrin at Melrose, perhaps he was driven to imagine the wealth that cotton planting could one day generate for him too.
Candice Candeto finished her presentation with an examination of a modest, portable desk that belonged to Robert Stewart's son. Its contents provided her with a tangible link to the subject of her research.
Designed to rest atop a table or a stand, the desk in its portability reflects the mobility of people and goods that was central to the shop's success. Its modest form reminds us of the locally produced furniture that played an important role in Natchez daily life, but which can be obscured by more elaborate, ornamented imports. Inside the desk, paper notes adhered to the lid provide a fascinating glimpse into the shop and its founding family. Some are just ordinary references to daily operations, including notes about shipments or customer orders, and there's actually a really interesting recipe for furniture polish. But others are a little more curious and really kind of got me scratching my head for a while. This is a handwritten list of Lincoln's cabinet members, dating before 1863, and notably, it includes each cabinet member's home state right after their name, and the majority of those are northern. This scrap to me, in this context, glued to the inside of a Mississippi cabinet maker's desk, is really just dripping with regional tension. It to me reads as a politically aware Southerner who is just watching how all of this is playing out right at the beginning of the Civil War. Poignantly, Robert Hill also included a memento of his late father in this genealogical reference. You can see on the screen here it says Robert Stewart, born November 20th, 1795, Chester County, PA, died 7th June 1866, Bunches Bend, Louisiana, which is where the Stewart plantation was. This pair of notes, one which is looking outward, the other inward, reflects the dual forces that shaped Robert Stewart's business. National political and economic forces impacted the shop as it evolved, but so did personal ones: health, ambitions, and family. Today, the surviving furniture of the shop of Robert Stewart speaks to a network of complex social, economic, and racial factors which are critical to our understanding of the early Gulf South. Though scholars once believed that little significant furniture production took place in Mississippi after 1820, Stewart's shop decidedly rewrites this story. The 5,507 pieces of furniture that Stewart recorded producing between 1834 and 1856, including the at least a dozen surviving pieces that I've cataloged so far, create instead a more complex picture of a Mississippi furnished with both high-style imports and the products of local craftsmen.
So why does a furniture shop from the 1800s matter? What does it tell us about Polk's America? Well, like Candice Candeto, we must look closely at the chest of drawers or the table. We must look for the stories in the objects, for the hands that built it. We often measure history by political events, wars, panics, revolutions. But for most of us, our history is measured by personal events, the birth of a child, an illness, a career change. Such was the case for the shop of Robert Stewart and those who labored there. And in a way, an intimate history like Robert Stewart's is a more relatable history, because it finds the humanity that is so often lost when tackling the big ideas and personas in American history.
And I think that this is an important reminder for us and really for me, since I now spend my days interpreting a United States president, that as much as we can learn about America broadly by looking at figures like James K. Polk, there's also a lot that we can learn about Polk's America by looking at the individuals who historians are just now beginning to get to know. Men and women from all different backgrounds who, like Robert Stewart, lived relatively ordinary lives, but ones which have so much to teach us about their times. And that's really why we do this series, this Polk's America thing that we gather every month to do, which, to an extent, it's to zoom out and also to zoom in, to look at James K. Polk's world from every possible angle. And by doing that, to get to know the 11th president a little better by getting to know his world.
This has been Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel. For more information, visit www.jameskpolk.com. Thanks for listening.